Welcome. Good morning and welcome. So I'm Sarwar Kashmiri, a member of the Summer Lecture Committee and your moderator for today's event, which is the last one in this wonderful series on China-US relations. Also like to welcome, well, first of all, welcome to all of you at the Lebanon Opera House. Welcome to those watching on live stream. Welcome also to those joining us remotely from the University of Georgia and UMass Boston. May I remind you to please turn your iPhones off. Want to have a very special thanks for our underwriters who support the entire 2023 series. They are the Byrne Foundation, Caldwell Law, Concord Coach, Kendall at Hanover, Ledyard Bank, and The Village. Thank you also to Three Tomatoes for your sponsorship of the event. You know, this series is the work of the planning committee chaired by Anne Hargrave, who kept us all in order, and the other members are Genia Allison, Peter Blaler, Martha Clark, Ellen Frost, Peter Paquette, Steve Schama, Bill Sullivan, and Steve Tokel. Special thanks also to the OSHER staff, Lisa King and Sarah Chamberlain, who really did an outstanding job of putting all of this together for us, as shorthanded as they are. Now, this is a live program, so we encourage you and the audience on the live links to please ask questions. Those in the auditorium were given an index card, and so you can write your question on it and drop it in the basket, which is right here under the podium. Staff member will transcribe the questions and give them to me during the break. Now, if you like, please add your name, first name, and location to your question. We'd also like to invite you to a post-lecture discussion session which will be held immediately after the lecture in the OSHER classroom 3A. Just ask anyone from the staff that's here. They'll be happy to direct you. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Ryan Haas. You know, it's really superfluous to introduce Ryan Haas. It seems as though whenever you have something to discuss on China-US relations, he's on PBS, he's on CNN, he's a leading newspaper, he's in the leading newspapers almost every day, but let me give it a try. So Ryan Haas is director of the Brookings Center, also co-chair in Taiwan Studies at Brookings. Previously served at the White House during the Obama administration as director for China, Taiwan, Mongolia in the National Security Council. Prior to working at the NSC, he served as a foreign service officer in the Beijing and Seoul embassies. He's the author of numerous publications, including the recent best-selling book, which is called Stronger. Now, most important, he's married to his college sweetheart from the University of Washington. Together, Ryan and Meredith have 4 kids, ranging from 8 to 15 years of age. He still looks 19. Now, my own connection with Ryan began a number of years ago when I was doing research for my book on China, and I asked a senior Obama official who to talk to about China. And the answer was, from the president on down, whenever we have a question on China, we go see Ryan Haas. So please welcome Mr. Ryan Haas. So Ryan, we're in Lebanon, New Hampshire. This area has had a long connection with China. 1776, John Ledyard, a name that is widely known in this area, 25-year-old student studying to be a missionary, dropped out of Dartmouth College, shipped out with the Royal Navy on Captain James Cook's third and final voyage. 6 years later, the sailor, John Ledyard, returned to America to proselytize for trade with China. Then, when American ships first entered China for commercial reasons, Chinese didn't know where they're coming from. They didn't know what the flag was, right? At that time, America was just a bunch of boats bobbing on the water. They couldn't identify the flag, but they thought it was beautiful. They loved the colors, they thought the stars were flowers, and they gave the country a name, Mago, the beautiful country, which still holds. So Ryan, from those humble beginnings rose this huge relationship which exists today, right? US and China are the world's two largest economies. They represent 40% of the world's product, right? US exports to China support 1 million American jobs. But here we are at daggers drawn, officials not returning each other's phone calls. I know you have opening remarks. Can you try and help us through why this would be the case as you work through your remarks?
Well, sure, I will do my best. But before I do so, I do want to say thank you for such a kind introduction. I've never been described as looking 19 for a very long time, so I appreciate that, and I will take that with me and share it with my family when I get home. But I want to start out by thanking you for giving me this opportunity to be a part of the learning journey with you on China. I've followed the discussions that have taken place over the course of the summer in this room, and it's been sort of a dazzling assortment of viewpoints and perspectives. And so I'm honored to join in the discussion with you today. One of the impressions that I've taken away from listening to the various presentations throughout the summer is that there has been a high degree of pessimism and alarm about the overall direction of U.S.-China relations. I am an optimist by nature, so I'm going to try to provide a slightly different perspective from what you've heard over the course of this summer. It's going to be measured, but it will hopefully leave you with a measured degree of optimism. The final thought is that my emotion is not tied to anything I'm about to say. So in our discussion that will follow this opening period, I really welcome you to challenge, push back on anything I'm going to offer. But to address your question, Sarwar, how did we get to this daggers drawn moment? I think that it's valuable to look at the question through an American lens, a Chinese lens, and I will also offer my own. I think the American narrative, what I hear in Washington, D.C. often, is that the problem is that China has simply grown impatient and aggressive. Over the past decade, the nature, character, and manner by which China has pursued its ambitions has just fundamentally changed. And as a consequence of that, the relationship has shifted with it. And so repression at home has soured people's mood in the United States towards China, none more so than in Xinjiang, but also in Hong Kong and Tibet and elsewhere. But also China's increasingly impatient aggression in pursuit of its ambitions abroad has had a cooling effect on public attitudes towards China. The Chinese have drawn blood in the Himalayas for the first time in decades. They have built artificial islands in the South China Sea. They are daily harassing and pressuring people in Taiwan. And so the nature of China's activities has just fundamentally changed. And I think that this has also been accompanied by a growing perception that Xi Jinping represents China. And what Xi Jinping says, the Chinese leader says, is a reflection of China itself. Xi Jinping refers to himself as the core leader in China. He talks about the need for China to be second to none by the middle of this century, technologically, militarily, economically, and otherwise. He talks about the need for China to unify with Taiwan, and so therefore what Xi says reflects what China will do. And as a consequence of all of these things, my impression is that China increasingly is viewed by Americans as a threat to American interests and values that must be stopped. And this isn't just my own view. This isn't the view of people in the Beltway. This is the view of the American public. 50% of Americans identify China as the country's greatest threat. Now, that number is a bit skewed. It is 76% of Republicans and only 30% of Democrats who identify China as the greatest threat. But nevertheless, that is a significant sampling of views. But when I talk to my Chinese friends about why did we get to this moment in the relationship, the story is very different. From their vantage, America is an anxious, declining power that is seeking to hold on to its privileged position by doing harm to China, and that America is lashing out as a reflection of its insecurities. That we are bent on suppressing China's rise to counter the fact that we are eroding from within and our influence is diminishing abroad and our economic dynamism is fading. And if you accept that viewpoint, which many Chinese people do, there is no profit in compromise or concession with the United States because it will not reduce the overall pressure in the relationship. The solution to that problem is to just simply get stronger to the point that China has reached a level of power that forces the United States to accept China for what it is rather than what we wish it had or would become. And so we are in this moment where we are a prisoner of action-reaction dynamics. Both sides believe that the other has hostile intent towards them or is a threat or a challenge to their interests, values, and way of life. And insults invite rejoinders. Neither leader wants to accept a punch without throwing a counterpunch. And we are in this spiral dynamic in the relationship. And I think that's an honest assessment of how we got here. But for me, it doesn't fully capture what is going on. My own view is that we are in sort of a perfect storm. The United States and China at this moment are in a space where both sides feel vulnerable, both sides lack a degree of optimism about their future, and both feel threatened. And if you think about it from the United States perspective, we are going through extraordinary changes as a country and a society. Demographically, we are shifting, as we speak today, to a majority-minority country where the people who are non-white will represent a majority of the country by the coming decade or two. Our country is transitioning through the fourth industrial revolution, where automation, robotics, artificial intelligence is completely upending industries, changing jobs and livelihoods, and altering communities. We are experiencing sort of a tough stretch. The global financial crisis, Afghanistan, Iraq. We have encountered a series of setbacks and challenges in a relatively short period of time. And while all that has been happening, China has been experiencing this meteoric rise. And that feeling just has not sat well with many Americans. And so it does make sense to a certain degree that there would be such strong public feelings towards China in this moment. And this, I think, explains a lot of what is happening. But China is also going through a pretty dramatic change of its own. It is discontinuous with what the China that we have seen for the past 30 or 40 years. After Mao Zedong died and Deng Xiaoping took over around 1979, from 1979 until 2012, China was pragmatic, it was modest, it was willing to accept incremental, steady gains, it was focused on lifting up the lives of its people, and it tried not to present a threat to its neighbors or to the United States. I don't think you can say that about China today. I think that under Xi Jinping, China has taken on a different personality. Pragmatism has given way to a certain degree of ideology. Patience has given way to urgency. China is less willing to try to tamp down external anxieties about its actions. And so both sides are in this moment where it is clear that they see value and virtue in viewing the other as a threat or an enemy that can mobilize public action and national purpose to overcome obstacles. But I told you at the start that I'm an optimist, so I do want to offer a somewhat optimistic view, a few silver linings, one of which is that neither leader, neither Joe Biden nor Xi Jinping, sees value in direct conflict with each other. I've had an opportunity to be in, 14, 15 meetings with Xi Jinping. I had an opportunity to serve with President Biden when he was vice president. I have a sense of how they both think about and talk about the relationship. And my own view is that the closer you move to the center of power in both countries, the calmer the conversation gets about the overall relationship. In part because both leaders understand the stakes. They understand that there is no precedent in human history of two nuclear powers with long-range strike, cyber, and space capabilities ever fighting against each other, and that if we ever tested the proposition, it would be extraordinarily dangerous and difficult to control. The second silver lining is that this is not the first time that the United States and China have encountered a rough patch. We went through a period after the end of World War II until 1972 where there was really no communication between our two countries. There was no shared purpose. And we have found ways to work through it. We went through a rough patch in the late 1980s, early 1990s after the Tiananmen Square massacre. We found a way to work through it. It is possible for the two countries to find purpose again. And that leads to the final sort of thought that I would offer before I turn it back to Sarwar, which is that the relationship has rarely traveled in a straight line for very long. We went from enmity from 1949 to 1972 to cautious gradual opening when Kissinger and Nixon traveled to China in 1972. We went from sort of cautious optimism about reform and opening as China began to open to the outside world, to deep disappointment after the Tiananmen incident. We went from sort of a shared sense of purpose about integrating China into the global economy and the international system to a period of deep frustration and talk of decoupling and de-risking in the relationship now. So the relationship has had a lot of zigs and zags. It never has traveled a straight line for long. And I think it would be a challenge for anyone to tell you convincingly that from this point forward, it will forevermore travel the straight line that it is on today. It has always been a flaw of anyone who looks to the future by analyzing the present in the U.S.-China relationship, and I don't think that has changed. So that's sort of how I see how we've gotten to this moment, Sarwar. The one issue that is going to, I think, be the most difficult for us to manage is going to be Taiwan. And I wonder if you agree with that.
No, I in fact totally agree with it. And what I want to do was probe a little more in what you've said by focusing on Xi Jinping. In the media, Xi Jinping is portrayed as someone who has now become president for life, right? And he's portrayed as someone who's almost a dictator, that he's taken care of all the people that oppose him and removed them from the office by various means. And so he is the unchallenged paramount leader, as you've mentioned. I wonder if you think that portrayal of Xi Jinping is right, and together with that, I would like to also throw in that there are a number of very senior military officers in America who are warning the public about the dangers of China and how war is impending. And I wonder if you can talk about what you think of Xi Jinping, whether this portrayal is right, and whether you are concerned or that's just the way it should be for senior military officers to speak up.
Well,
I told you easy questions at the beginning.
On Xi Jinping, I have zero interest in serving as an advocate or explainer of his views or actions. I find much of what he has done disdainful. But I also think that it is a bit of an exaggeration to conclude that he alone represents the future of China or is the sole articulator of China's ambitions and dreams. In many ways, he is the inheritor of China's goals rather than the architect of them. It has been a goal since the 1930s for China to experience a national rejuvenation. This wasn't an idea that he created. It has been a goal since the 1930s for China to unify with Taiwan. This was not a goal that he created. But what he has done is he has just applied a harder edge to everything that China does. A sort of a bravado, a don't mess with me, Texas type of attitude towards China's conduct in the world. And I think that this is done more to alienate than attract the partners that China seeks. I think that Xi Jinping's inveterate Leninism is doing challenges to China's ability to achieve its national goals. If China aspires to be the world-leading technological power, stripping the agency of private enterprise in China is a curious way to drive towards that goal. If China aims to have unrivaled influence and soft power, bullying countries all over the world is a curious way to achieve that goal. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that he is not infallible. He, I think, is making very considerable mistakes that are imperiling China's own ambitions. But he also is not the sole source of power in China. China, for anyone, and I know that many of you have spent time in China, and many of you have spent considerable time in China, it's a diverse place. It possesses 1/5 of the world's population. It is not North Korea. People don't march in lockstep through Tiananmen Square. There are a range of interest in China, but there also, I think, is not a high value in directly confronting Xi Jinping now. I think a lot of stakeholders, a lot of people who have vested interest in China are trying to play a long game and position themselves for the future because they recognize what we do, that he is a mortal person who will pass from the scene. It may be 5 years, it may be 10 years, it may be 15 years. I can't tell you that. But as Xi Jinping leaves, I think that China will probably correct for some of its excesses that has been produced by Xi Jinping, in the same way that they corrected for the excesses of Mao Zedong, in the same way that Xi Jinping has corrected for what he identifies as the excesses of Deng Xiaoping, in allowing too much free enterprise, too much freedom, too much looseness in Chinese society. So this pattern will continue in the same way that it has before. On the second question, Sarwar, there is, I think, a school of thought in Washington, D.C. that Americans underappreciate the threat that China poses to the United States, and that Americans need to be awoken so that we can rise together to the challenge that China presents. And this is very much a theme, for example, of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, which Representative Mike Gallagher leads, but also of various military leaders. And I think that it's a good faith effort to try to energize the American public to meet a challenge, but I'm not sure that it is possible in this moment for us to scare the American public into altering the way that our country operates on the basis of a potential future challenge posed by China. You know, as I think back, I can't think of really any examples in human history where the United States public was preemptively inspired to action to meet a threat. Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried for years. He was a very powerful president. It wasn't until Pearl Harbor that he was able to get the American people mobilized to a challenge. And that was while Nazi Germany was marching across Europe in plain sight. So if it was difficult then, I think it's going to be even harder now in the fractured media environment that we face to mobilize the American public to meet this challenge or threat from China. And the risk of us over-cranking on this effort is a couple. The first is that it comes at a cost in our ability to manage tensions with China. When we were perpetually sort of putting logs on the fire of intensifying the amount of urgency and anger that people feel towards China. But second, it pulls us out of alignment with many of our allies and partners who don't view China solely as a threat, but see both threat and opportunity from China. From my perspective, one of America's unique asymmetric strengths is our ability to harness collective action with allies and partners in ways that put pressure on China. And to the extent that we take actions of our own that make that harder, I think that we risk doing more damage than benefit by going down that path.
Thank you. You brought up the issue, hinted at Taiwan, and I'd just like to probe that a little bit, if I may, because I know that lots of people think that that's a real tripwire between the two as far as the relations are concerned. So is it really a tripwire? Why? We always hear words about strategic ambiguity and strategic clarity. And what do you think?
Well, I think Taiwan has always been the thorniest issue in the U.S.-China relationship, and the same is true today, as it was in 1972, in 1982, in 1992, in 2002, and 2012. It will be as well in 2032 and 2042 as well. Taiwan is the hardest issue for the United States and China to manage because we have fundamentally different views on it. And the issue of Taiwan, it traces back. This isn't a new issue. When the Chinese Communist Party was founded, one of the promises that they made to the Chinese people was that if they gained power, they would return China in whole and return it to its past historic glory. That was the promise they made to the Chinese people in the 1920s. And in the period since, they have really, I think it's safe to say, established firm control in Xinjiang, in Tibet, in Hong Kong. The one missing jewel in the crown is Taiwan. And China's leaders are determined to complete that process. This is part of the founding mission and ethos of the Chinese Communist Party. And when the United States and China established relations, the Chinese really made three big requests of the United States, three conditions for establishing relations. The first was to accept that there is only one China in the world. The second was to acknowledge that Taiwan is a part of China. And the third was to break the mutual defense treaty that existed between the United States and Taiwan and not use Taiwan as a platform for force projection in the Asia-Pacific. So that was their conditions for establishing relations. We agreed that there is only one China in the world. We acknowledged China's position that Taiwan is a part of China, but we didn't accept it, and we broke the mutual defense treaty. But in return, we, the United States, insisted that we would maintain robust unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan, that we would continue to sell arms to Taiwan, and that we would insist that any resolution to cross-strait differences be done peacefully. Those were our conditions. And that was the deal. And that deal has preserved the peace for the past, 40-plus years. But now I think there's growing anxiety about whether or not that's enough to continue to preserve the peace. Xi Jinping, as we were talking about, is nakedly ambitious in his desire to acquire Taiwan. China is purchasing the option of use of force by investing dramatically in expanding military capabilities that would be used in a Taiwan contingency, particularly to exploit America's vulnerabilities in such a conflict. And we are watching daily a reminder of what it looks like when a revanchist major power takes action to right a historic wrong in Ukraine. And so this, I think, has had a focusing effect on people's views in the United States. The other issue, I think, is that it's becoming harder to sort of anticipate and read Xi Jinping. There is a growing concern that, that he may be suffering isolated emperor syndrome, where he is becoming more and more detached from the professional bureaucracy. The advice and counsel that he's receiving is becoming more accommodative of his own preferences and biases, and that this could invite sort of a dangerous dynamic. And this is, I think it's fed a debate in the United States about whether or not our longstanding approach is sufficient to the moment, whether it's going to allow us to continue to hold on to the status quo. And this has led to a debate about what Sarwar referred to a moment ago about strategic ambiguity or strategic clarity. What that means, I think, basically is strategic ambiguity is this idea that there are two paths that could lead us to conflict in the Taiwan Strait. One is if China were to use force to invade Taiwan. The other is if Taiwan were to declare independence and provoke or precipitate a conflict not of our choosing. And the premise of strategic ambiguity is that by being ambiguous about how, when, where the United States would intervene militarily, it has a chilling or cooling effect on both leaders in Taiwan and leaders in China, and has a disincentivizing influence upon whether or not they would choose to use or take actions that could provoke conflict. And to be honest, strategic ambiguity is a shorthand. It's not a policy. No one in the United States government walks around talking about strategic ambiguity. It's something that those of us who have the privilege of working on China and Taiwan get to talk about outside of government. But the idea of strategic clarity is that no, we shouldn't be ambiguous. We should be absolutely clear that if China invades Taiwan, the United States will use the full force of its military power to try to repel and push back a Chinese invasion. And that by being clear, we can have a greater deterrent effect on Xi Jinping's thinking and could reduce the likelihood of him risking it all. My own view is that the United States is at its best on Taiwan issues when we're resolute, when we're confident, when we're consistent, when we're disciplined in what it is that we're trying to achieve. And what we are trying to achieve is preservation of the status quo of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. We're not trying to achieve an outcome to what is basically the artifact of an unresolved civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang. We are trying to keep a path open so that eventually, it could be next year, it could be next decade, it could be next century, leaders in Taiwan and China are capable of peacefully resolving their differences. And this is something that sort of runs against the grain of America's strategic culture. When we see problems around the world, we like to try to solve them. It's unique in the case of Taiwan that we are not actually trying to solve a problem. We're trying to keep space open for others to solve it themselves. And when you look at the challenge in that light, I think it makes it a bit harder to make a compelling case for strategic clarity. And I'm happy to talk further about that if there's interest in it.
I used to impress people by using that phrase, strategic ambiguity, and now nobody's going to be impressed. You said it's... But one other issue, this, Ambassador Stapleton Roy, who's legendary in the State Department, traveled with Nixon to open China. And he always says that we need to remember that at that time, the Vietnam War was, going on. American military personnel were in jail. Some of them were in China. There was bombing. Chinese arms were being used to kill Americans. But Mr. Nixon sensed an opportunity and went to China. It couldn't have been a more horrible time for the two leaders to compromise. But both leaders in China and in the U.S. showed great determination and great strategic relevance. So my question to you is are we seeing a lack of leadership at this point? Is there a vacuum of leadership? That's what Mr. Roy says when he talks about that time and how China was open with Mr. Nixon. What do you think? I know I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit. If so, we can go ahead and talk about Barbie or something.
I do have a 15-year-old daughter, so I feel fluent on that topic. But, President Nixon made a bold gambit. But he did so for a larger strategic purpose that I think many Americans could understand, which was the greater challenge to the United States at that time was not China, it was the Soviet Union. And pulling China closer to help cope with the challenges that the Soviet Union posed to us was a proposition that had value and could be understood by the American people. That dynamic isn't available to American leaders today. So there is a bit of an apples versus oranges comparison to why we don't have a leader with the courage or boldness of Richard Nixon to reset the relationship with China. And, to be honest, I don't think that the Chinese are particularly hopeful that Americans will travel to Beijing with a similar offer for resetting the relationship today. I think that both sides have developed a bit of cynicism and fatalism about the direction of the relationship right now. And it's reflected on a daily basis in the words that leaders in both countries use to refer to each other. President Biden has referred to Xi Jinping as a dictator as recently as last month or the month before. He taunted him in the State of the Union address. And, you know, he's, I think, reflecting a certain zeitgeist in the United States towards China. But all in due time, Sarwar. You know, I don't think that the U.S.-China relationship is going to be resolved in the next week, month, or year. We're going to be around for a long time. The United States isn't going anywhere. China's not going anywhere. And I think with a certain degree of sort of fortitude, resoluteness, and strategic patience, we'll be able to navigate our way through.
Thank you for that. I'm going to tangent now to these high-level talks, right? There's much ink being spread in the media about the beginnings of easing of the relationship. Talks are starting between the United States and China. So I wanted to ask you whether you think there is a great chance of success there. You know, we were at the firing end here at the summer lecture series. We were to get a high-ranking Chinese general to come here and work with an American naval officer. We had the Consul General of China in New York who was to come talk about financial things. And at the very last moment, they dropped out, which left a real kink in the preparation that we'd done. So I'm going to ask you, what are the chances, you think, of these new initiatives succeeding, right? I mean, we have to talk. There's no way out of that. But should we be optimistic? What are your thoughts?
I don't think that the United States-China relationship in this present moment is significantly improving, nor is it significantly deteriorating. I think we're in a bit of an exploratory period right now. And the reason why I say that is mostly tactical. I think when you put yourselves in the shoes of both leaders, they both have their own incentive to want to cool things down a bit in the current moment. If you are Xi Jinping right now, and you look out at the world, you have over 20% youth unemployment, an economy that is decelerating. There's talk of China's economy moving into deflation. The property sector, which accounts for over a quarter of China's GDP, is sagging. Exports are not serving as an engine of growth. The overall external environment for China is pretty choppy. And the United States is experiencing progress in tightening its relationships with allies and partners in Asia and Europe. On top of that, if you're Xi Jinping, you know that you're going to be traveling to San Francisco in November for the APEC leaders meeting, and you want to be treated with dignity and respect. You want to be treated as a world leader of major significance, not receive the same treatment as a leader of Cambodia would at such an event. And so if you're Xi Jinping, you have incentive to try to cool things down a bit with the United States. If you're Joe Biden is a career politician who is facing an election in a coming year. He recognizes that China will be a feature of the national debate and that it is impossible for him to win a debate on China over who can be the bigger hawk on China. That is not available for him, no matter who the Republican candidate ends up being. And so the best option he has is to try to create contrast between himself as someone who is capable of competently managing a very complex, contentious relationship with China versus the other side, which could represent chaos and bring the United States to the brink of catastrophe with China. If you want to try to build that contrast, you need to start now to show that you and your administration are capable of meeting face-to-face, working through issues with your Chinese counterparts, and establishing a modicum of stability amidst a very contentious relationship. And so not because either leader has developed warmness or affinity for the other, but simply from raw calculations of political interest. In this moment today, they both have their own incentives to try to cool things down. And I think that those incentives will carry forward through the fall and probably into early next year. But the question, the harder question is, what should they try to do during this moment when they both see incentive to try to cool down the relationship? Because after a while, meeting for the sake of meeting is going to lose its novelty, and people are going to begin criticizing the Biden administration for getting caught into a trap of not taking hard actions against China and instead being satisfied with just meeting for the sake of meeting. And so President Biden needs to try to get something done during this moment. A few ideas that I think they are considering are around Ukraine. Somewhat counterintuitively, China and the United States both see risk in the perpetuation of conflict in Ukraine for different reasons. We don't want to see suffering continue in Ukraine. The Chinese worry that the longer that the war goes on, the greater the risk that their partner in Moscow, Vladimir Putin, could be exposed to instability or threats to his control or leadership. And I think the Chinese also recognize that the longer that China is seen as aiding and abetting Russia's atrocities in Ukraine, the less likely it is that they will be able to repair their image in Europe. And the Chinese feel a need to try to improve their relationships in Europe because they want the Europeans to be more equidistant between the United States and China and not be shifting into the United States camp to put pressure on China. So this could present a space for both sides to find some commonality of purpose. I think on artificial intelligence, this is an issue that has resonance for both countries, and both countries are struggling to try to figure out how to deal with it and manage it. But particularly in the national security realm, there are very sort of specific issues where mutual self-interest would be advanced by establishing restraints on uses of artificial intelligence. And I'll just offer one practical example. It would be possible to develop an artificial intelligence system to decide to launch a nuclear weapon. They could make a decision at a more rapid pace than Americans or Chinese could on a human level going through chains of command if they felt like there was an imminence of attack and that they needed to respond quickly. That's frightening as hell, the idea that we would defer to a computer to make a decision about nuclear launch. It scares the Chinese, it scares us. If we were able to establish an understanding that humans must remain in control of decisions like that, it would be in both sides' interest. Food security is another issue where I think we both have shared interest, as well as really in many issues in the Middle East. So there is a menu available for the two leaders to work on if they choose to. And if they do, on some or all those issues, the relationship will look qualitatively different at the end of this year than it does today. So I think that we should keep an open mind and stay tuned to watch for progress there.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned coming together over issues. I wanted to ask you about Ukraine, because it seems to me that Ukraine has done a number of things, but it's also exposed both China and America to the idea that there is a whole group of countries that doesn't want to be told, come this side or come that side. The so-called global south, you might have heard that phrase being used in the media. So the global south with Brazil and India and so on, right there, not supporting American sanctions, but neither are they not condemning China or the Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. So what does that do? Is that another area that might bring actually America and China together as to what is this group of 10 or 12 countries that is standing in the middle? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think that you're putting your finger on a really important issue. There are hedging powers in the world that are looking on an issue-by-issue basis to figure out where their interests are best served. And I think it's been disappointing for many in Washington that there are so many countries that have been unwilling to condemn Russia for what is clearly naked aggression to try to rewrite borders in 2023. The Chinese have contributed to this by never missing an opportunity to highlight the hypocrisy of the United States using force without United Nations Security Council authorization in Iraq and Bosnia and other areas, in Panama, while we are outraged by Russia doing the same in Ukraine. Now, I think for all of us, the moral equivalence of those two actions is very very different and it's easy to puncture. But we have to also acknowledge that, that this argument does get traction in parts of the global south that feel frustrated, that they are suffering from problems not of their making, whether it's from climate change, from pandemics, from inflationary pressures around the world, from food security issues, and that the United States, as the world's leader, is not doing enough to address or resolve their differences. So the way that I think about it is I think it should serve as a, a bit of an alarm bell for us that we need to up our game if we want to continue to be able to attract and pull these countries in our preferred directions.
So just a few more seconds on this point. One of the best informed Russian military officials told me not too long ago that he wished that the United States had not defined the Ukrainian conflict as a war between democracy and autocracy. That if the United States had said, listen, you can't invade a neighboring country, it's against the United Nations, can't be done, that we would probably have carried a lot of the global south with us. But when we defined it as a war between democracy and autocracy, most countries, or many countries in the world, are not liberal democracies. Do you think there's anything in that statement that we should have not gone in that direction?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I would agree with the premise of the statement that we define the war as a contest between democracy versus autocracy. I think that we saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine as what it was, act of naked aggression against a people that were simply trying to defend their own sovereignty. So to the extent that it is framed in those terms, I do agree that it would be counterproductive for our ability to pull countries closer to us, but I'm not convinced that the United States is at fault or at guilt for describing Russia's invasion of Ukraine in those terms.
Okay. Before I let you finish with what are your thoughts on steps forward, I have one more thing to open up, and that is this business of communication, right? The exchanges, students between the United States and China are almost frozen. So there were reports in the Financial Times a couple of days ago that university exchanges between Russia and China are increasing, right? And so I wanted to ask you, you work for probably the best known think tank in Washington, are there plans to start exchanges with Chinese organizations like yours? Do you think that we're going to be moving ahead to restart student-to-student programs? What are you picking up in Washington?
Well, I actually am receiving a lot of guests from China that are visiting Washington these days in a sign of a certain sign of the people-to-people connections. I think that this is a really important point. If you look back at sort of the history of the U.S.-China relationship, people-to-people relations are usually sort of a leading indicator of the direction of travel of the overall relationship. When the people-to-people relationship between the people of the United States and China is bad, the relationship usually becomes bad as well. When people-to-people connections between both countries are strong, it usually has an effect on the overall direction of the relationship itself. So if you look at the current moment, there are around 300 American students studying in China, so about the same number of people that are participating in our dialogue today in all of China. There are around 300,000 Chinese students studying in the United States. I don't think that advantages us. I think that it's a real problem. A colleague of mine, Elizabeth Economy, who's not dovish on China, has written recently in the Financial Times that no good coach would ever pass up an opportunity to take a first-hand look at the other team's playbook and state of mind. And I think that is true for our relationship between the United States and China. Ignorance is not an ingredient for effective policy. And the less insight, access, first-hand knowledge we have as to what's really going on in China, the less capable we're going to be of crafting truly effective approaches for dealing with China. So I certainly hope that as the COVID situation recedes and more opportunities emerge for interaction between our two peoples, that we will, as a country, as a society, take up that opportunity and that task. At Brookings, where I work, it's a think tank. We try to do our small part to model this. We maintain several ongoing Track 2 dialogues with Chinese counterparts on the role of artificial intelligence, on economic issues, as well as on the future of the U.S.-China relationship. And just one final thought on this, Sarwar, which is that as I reflect back on the history of the U.S.-China relationship from 1972 to present, there has been a single ingredient that has been visible in every instance in which the United States and China have effectively managed, dealt with, or resolved a problem. In each instance that I can find, it has always been done by senior officials who are empowered, who have authority, and who have an understanding of each other's priorities and constraints and have a relationship with each other. This has been the thread that has connected every instance in which our two countries have been able to manage tough problems. Even during the Trump administration, it was the U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, who spent considerable time with his Chinese counterpart, Liu He. And at the end of multiple years of meeting frequently and talking constantly, they reached the Phase 1 trade agreement. So this has been a common thread. We can't lose sight of this. We don't talk with our Chinese counterparts because it's fun. We do it because it's our responsibility as a major power, and I hope that we continue to do so.
So, Ryan, this is, the final event of the sixth lecture series, right? And under Anne Hargrave's brilliant chairmanship of this planning committee, we've tried to present a rounded education, if I may use the word. Each lecture has dealt with an important issue. And we wanted to have you here at the last event so that you could now put that all together for us, that knowledge that people have. I said that incorrectly. What we'd like you to do is tell us what are the steps forward that you would recommend. Where do we go from here? What would you like to see?
If I had to make a T-shirt for what I would like to see, it would have 4 words on it: more realism, less fatalism. And what I mean by that is that we have to acknowledge certain uncomfortable truths in the relationship that exists between the United States and China. We have sought for 60-plus years to impose our will on Cuba, a small country 90 miles to the south of us that is a fraction the size of our economy. We've had pretty limited effect. Last time I checked, Cuba is still Cuba. The idea that we are going to impose our will upon China, a proud civilizational state of 1.4 billion people with the second largest economy in the world, is something that we're going to have to interrogate. If we believe that muscularity is going to allow China to accept what we want them to do and who we want them to be, we're setting ourselves up for failure. We're setting ourselves up for frustration. And that is going to fuel further friction and tension in the relationship. We are not going to wrestle China to the past. We are not going to push it back within its borders to live in isolation. That is not available to us. And we need to be honest about that. We also need to be honest that our interests and our values are going to compel us to push back against behaviors by China that we find problematic or that violate our sense of the role of human rights or democracy or other issues in the world. That there is going to be a certain degree of friction that is priced into the relationship. That's okay. Major powers often have conflicting interests. But we're also going to have to coexist with these guys whether we like them or not. And that's the part of realism that I hope that we can sort of work ourselves toward as a country and a society. And one of the things that I feel like could help us in that direction is a little bit more of a sense of what it is we're trying to achieve with China. What are our goals with China? It's a lot easier to diagnose problems and frustrations than it is to present goals or benchmarks of progress. And I'm afraid I didn't come here with any perfect answer to that question, but more just an acknowledgement that this is where we need to go in our discussion and our discourse. But I do have a few initial ideas about what types of goals we should be focused on, or priorities. I think it is important for us to be able to uphold the credibility of our security commitments to our allies and our partners, because our alliances underpin America's role of global leadership. And if the credibility of those commitments is eroded, so too will be the foundation of our global leadership. So that compels us to maintain a certain capacity to deter aggression against America's allies and security partners. I do think that it is important for us as Americans to encourage China to accept greater responsibility for global leadership. With responsibility comes a certain expectation or obligation that they will chip in their fair share to deal with problems as well. When you look at issues like food security, where at the United Nations, the United States contributes over 50% of the budget for the World Food Program, and China contributes 0.88%, that's not right. That's not fair. And it should be an expectation of ours and a goal of ours to encourage China to rise to meet the obligations that come with its growing leadership. I think it's important for us to continue to encourage China to open its markets and to do more to be responsive to the demands of their citizens. This doesn't mean that we have the option or ability of imposing democracy on China, but we should, live out our values and be true to them. And, this is going to be hard work. It's going to be a generational task. It's going to require us to strengthen coordination with our allies. It's going to require us to bolster our deterrent capability. It's going to require us to preserve our innovation edge as a country, which is going to obligate us to do more to realize the potential of our people, but also to continue to attract the best ideas and brightest minds from around the world to want to come, live here, work here, and apply their talents here. So this is a tough task, but it's a task that I think is within our reach. But the other piece of this is fatalism. It's really easy to be cynical about China. I see it every day. I find myself being cynical at times too. Xi Jinping is a tough guy to like. What China is doing is problematic. It is putting stress on the international system. It is putting stress on our interests. It is putting strain on our values. But Xi Jinping is mortal. There have been shifts in Chinese politics before when significant leaders have passed. There will be corrections for the excesses of Xi Jinping again in the future. There is no permanence in international relations. Our former enemies are now our closest friends. Germany, Japan, others. And there will be a future generation of leaders that reach the realization that their ability to achieve their national ambitions will be made easier with a functional relationship with the United States than a hostile relationship with the United States. So even as we're resolute and tough in the current moment and pushing back on things that we find unacceptable, we also should have the courage to be optimistic and hopeful and ambitious about the future. I think back to John F. Kennedy at the height of the Cold War, delivered a speech at American University talking about the future that he hoped could be developed between the United States and Soviet Union, even amidst the extraordinary stresses and challenges of that time in the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We are making Xi Jinping's life easier for him by constantly presenting ourselves as hostile to China's ambitions. We're making it easier for him to deflect the frustrations that many people in China feel to the United States as the cause of why China is not making more progress. If we are able to present a vision that allows for the United States and China to each reach for their own national ambitions, even as we remain steadfast in defending our own interests and values, I think it'll put more stress on Xi Jinping than insults or tough words would in the current moment.
Well, I'm starting to understand a bit more why everyone in the Obama administration, when they had China on their minds, came to you for advice. I hope you all agree with me that this has been an absolutely fabulous talk. Did someone say encore? We'll take a break. Thank you very much. So, Anne, can we order in lunch? There's so many questions here, this can go on for the day. Well, if you thought the first hour was hard. There are so many questions. I had to literally pull out a third of all the questions that came in from you, the audience, and from Zoom. So I hope we can get through as many of these can. I'll try and combine some of them. This question is a real relevant one. How can we, in this area of polarization, develop a long-term policy for dealing with China? And I'll add a line from my side to it, which is, but we've done it before, right, Ryan? The Cold War, the policy of containment, it stretched on over administrations, Democrats and Republicans. So I'm just adding that to the question.
These are, incredibly hard questions that I wish I had better answers for. I read recently a book, The Paranoid Style of American Politics by Richard Hofstadter. And one of the themes of that book was that America has gone through cycles of reactionary populism over the course of its entire history. In every 40 or 50-year cycles of sort of this reactionary wave of populist rage and energy and animosity. I think we're probably in one of those cycles now. There's so much change that's happening so quickly in our society that it's easy for people to feel, unmoored and not rooted, and to feel frustrated and angry, and to be susceptible to arguments that others are to blame for the frustrations that they're feeling. And this isn't the first time that China has been a salient issue in a presidential debate. In fact, I think that 2008, 2012 were probably the exceptions to the rule. In both of those election cycles, there was, more or less a decision made that China was too consequential of an issue to politicize because it would shrink space for governance after the election ended. If you set those two aside, it's sort of been the historic norm to inflame rhetoric around China around presidential election cycles, and then it sort of dissipates a bit and then comes back up for the next presidential election cycle. The difference now is that rhetoric around China has been inflamed, but it hasn't come back down and dissipated. It's just sort of traveled in a one-way direction. And I think it will for a bit of time to come, certainly through this next presidential election cycle, and we'll see what happens. I mean, nobody knows what will happen in the next presidential election. But you in this room will have an outsized influence on that outcome, given the role that New Hampshire has in the selection process. But I think that my own view is that over the span of time, countries are guided by their national interest in the actions and decisions they make. And America's national interests aren't necessarily advanced or improved by allowing sort of uncontrollable escalation of tensions and rhetoric towards China. The risk of war with China is not something that makes America stronger, safer, healthier, or more prosperous. And so I am confident that once we get through this cycle, however long it takes, that our interest will sort of take root, take traction, and guide our way forward and sort of shape the boundaries of the choices that are available to leaders. So in the near term, I think that we are where we are. In the mid to long term, I'm slightly more optimistic.
Do you think the Chinese know this election season we are in is called the silly season?
Yeah, our Chinese friends are pretty familiar with America's presidential election cycles and presidential politics. How well they navigate through them is a different story, but they at least are intellectually aware.
So there are two questions that are asking about the disparity between American students studying in China and the large number of Chinese students studying in America. And they're asking who has put the limit on the number of students? Why are there only 300 American students in China?
There is no limit that I'm aware of for American students to study in China. They just need to be admitted into a school and receive a visa to study there. The reality is that it's been really hard for many American students who want to study in China with COVID lockdown restrictions, and there's not direct flights between the United States and China, or very, very reduced flights between the United States and China at the moment. And so it's bureaucratically complex, frustrating, and there aren't as many programs that are recruiting for American students now. They're recruiting elsewhere in the world. And so that's how we got to where we are. But in recent months, Chinese universities have begun recruiting for American students again. I expect that the numbers will increase slightly. I hope they will. And Sarwar, I had an opportunity to talk with a few friends at the coffee break, and one of the questions that came up, I may be preempting you here, but is why would an American student want to study in China? And I think that's a really good question, and it's something that we should reflect upon, because studying in China isn't always easy, simple, or fun. It's a hard environment, and the academic culture is tough in China. And you are a permanent antibody. You look and sound different than all the other students in the university, so it's not the most welcoming environment always. But Chinese students are some of the best in the world. And Chinese industries are world-beating in many areas: electric vehicles, financial technology, renewable energy, quantum computing. These are areas where the United States and China are either neck and neck, or the Chinese are at the edge of the innovation frontier ahead of us. And if we aren't there to figure out where they're at, what they're learning, and how they're getting to where they're going, then we are disadvantaging ourselves. So I would love for us to take advantage of the opportunities that our students have to live, learn, and study in China.
So this question asks, why is Tibet so valuable to China? And given the frequent changes in our leadership in America, can we develop a long-range plan taking into account what's happened in Hong Kong, what's happening in Taiwan, and why is Tibet valuable to China? I thought that might...
It's a really good question. I think that there are a few layers of looking at the significance of Tibet for China. The first is from a strategic standpoint. Tibet is the strategic high ground of Asia. It is the meeting point of the Indian and the Chinese civilization. And as long as the Chinese control Tibet, they control the high ground in Asia. So that's not insignificant. But there's also just a belief, a cultural belief that Tibet is an inalienable part of China in the way that Alabama is to the United States. And so I don't expect that that's going to change. Particularly in the current moment, President Xi's father, Xi Jinping, played a very active role in Tibet at a very tumultuous time, and sort of working to bring Tibet into the fold of what is now the People's Republic of China. And so I think that his family in particular has a pretty strong feeling about the role of Tibet as a piece and element of China.
This person says Taiwan imports nearly all of its non-renewable energy. What happens if China blockades Taiwan? Does the U.S. Navy try to break the blockade and risk war?
I think one of Taiwan's most acute vulnerabilities is the fact that they've chosen not to stockpile food or fuel or munitions or medicine, which makes them very vulnerable to a potential blockade. And one of the things that I hope that the next leader in Taiwan does, whoever he or she is to try to address this problem to reduce the vulnerability that Taiwan would face in the event of a blockade which would have the effect of reducing the attraction or the incentive for China to try to pursue a blockade of Taiwan. But a blockade would, essentially be an act of war, and it would put extraordinary pressure upon any American leader to respond. A colleague of mine at the Brookings Institution has done modeling on what would happen between U.S. and Chinese naval forces in the event of a blockade. And he's run the model multiple times. And the result that he's come up with is that it's too close to tell what would happen in the event of a blockade, which is frightening in one respect for us, but it also should be unsettling for our Chinese counterparts as well. One of America's unique advantages, and I don't know if the Admiral spoke about it or not when he was here, but is our undersea warfare capabilities. Our submarines are far superior to Chinese submarines, and that's a unique advantage that would be brought to bear if the Chinese ever were to contemplate trying to implement a blockade around Taiwan.
Something you just touched on a couple of seconds ago. What is the potential impact of Japanese elections and U.S. elections on U.S.-China and Taiwan relations? And I might throw in also the Taiwan elections next year.
Well, I'm prepared to be proven wrong, but my general sense is that the political leadership in Japan is pretty committed to viewing Taiwan as critical to Japan's own security. So it's not out of any good-hearted benevolence or ideological affinity, but just out of raw calculation of strategic requirements. Japan views Taiwan as central to protecting their southern flank, and that if Taiwan were occupied by, let's say, the People's Republic of China, then Japan's southern flank would be exposed. And so I think that that probably inoculates much fluctuation in Japan's sort of political culture about oscillating over support for Taiwan depending upon the outcome of any election. I think that they're pretty locked into seeing Taiwan security as critical to their own. Taiwan has a presidential and legislative election in January, and some people are anxious about the impact of that potentially upon our ability to preserve stability in the Taiwan Strait. I'm probably on the less alarmed end of the spectrum of people who look at this, not because I want to support or endorse any of Taiwan's candidates, but because Taiwan's voters are just deeply, deeply pragmatic. There is not a constituency in support of Taiwan making a bolt for the blue pursuit of independence right now, because there's a pretty clear understanding that could risk war, and the people of Taiwan certainly don't want to find themselves locked in war with China. And so, politicians are affected by their constituents and their supporters, and there is not support in Taiwan for pursuit of de jure independence right now. So I'm not overly concerned that Taiwan will be a precipitating factor of conflict, nor am I particularly concerned that the outcome of our presidential election in the United States could trip the United States into any type of conflict. We'll have to see. But if President Biden is reelected, he has a pretty steady mainstream view on Taiwan. If President Trump is reelected, he has demonstrated that Taiwan is not a major issue for him. It is not an issue in which he is interested in entertaining conflict with China over. So we'll wait and see, but that's sort of where I am at the moment.
So here's something that most people don't know about, doesn't come up often in the news, but the Chinese have purchased large pieces of agricultural land in the U.S. And so this person is asking, what should the U.S. do about the Chinese purchase of U.S. agricultural lands, especially those near U.S. military bases?
These are hard questions. Where I come out on this is that we should be sensitive to purchases of any land near American military bases, period. And we should establish a perimeter that is applied not just to China, but to any country of concern around purchases near American military bases. In terms of Chinese overall holdings of American agricultural land, I think it's somewhere around or less than 1% of overall available agricultural land in the United States. And so the Chinese have intense need for American agriculture, but I haven't seen conclusive evidence to suggest that they believe that purchasing American land is the best way to achieve access to it. They buy from us during our summer season. They buy from Brazil during Brazil's summer season. They've established a pretty clear pattern. They're the world's largest importer of agricultural products. They will be for some time to come. American agricultural production is near capacity, and so I don't lose a lot of sleep over the prospect of China buying up significant swaths of American agricultural property, but we should keep an eye on it. And if we see patterns emerge, we should probably respond.
Here's somebody who's memorized one of your lines, more realism, less fatalism. And they're asking, should the average American be hopeful in this election season? And how can the average citizen affect policy?
Well, asking me to comment on America's political elections is veering into the direction of irresponsible speculation. It's not an area of expertise. It's an area of passion, of course, like for many of us. But I think that there are lots of ways, particularly for residents of New Hampshire, to register their views and feelings about issues. The people of New Hampshire have an outsized opportunity to shape national discourse. And so they're, from writing, op-eds, from letters, from campaigns, there just are an abundance of opportunities for residents of this great state to register their views, I think.
President Biden recently added more restrictions on the sales of computer chips and other computer items. Isn't this just poking the tiger?
Well, President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave a speech a few months ago that didn't get a lot of attention, but it was fairly significant in laying out the Biden administration's view of economic competition globally, but also with a specific focus on China. And the speech really boiled down to three big arguments. One was that the United States needs to renew domestic manufacturing in the United States to create jobs, hardworking jobs for Americans, to sort of temper political passions in the United States. The second argument was that the United States needs to diversify supply chains so that we're not dependent upon any one country giving another country undue leverage over our decisions, with a particular emphasis, of course, on China. And then the third big argument was that the United States needs to be cautious about selling technology to China that could be used to create weapon systems that would be pointed at us. And whether you agree or disagree with the approach, I think that the actions that are being taken to try to restrict China's ability to acquire high-end semiconductors and other related technology is consistent with the goals or objectives that the Biden administration has laid out. In other words, there is a logic to their approach. And they talk often about wanting to create a small yard and a high fence. And what they mean is the small yard is a small set of technologies that are restricted for export. And of those technologies, there's a very high wall to protect them from leaking out of our country and being used by China. The challenge that we have with this approach is that the yard seems to keep on growing. It grew this week when the Biden administration announced a mechanism for screening outbound investment from the United States into certain sectors in China. And I had lunch with a Chinese diplomat earlier this week who complained that there are 1,300 sanctions, American sanctions on Chinese individuals or entities. And of those 1,300, 700 have been implemented during the Biden administration. And so it's on a near weekly basis, there's a new set of sanctions that are being imposed upon Chinese actors. And given that, how could the United States credibly argue that they're pursuing a small yard with a high fence? And so even though this is our mantra, and we believe we're justified and right in imposing these measures to defend ourselves, we should be mindful of the fact that that's not how these actions are being interpreted or received on the other end.
Here's one that'll keep us till tea time. What is India's role on the way forward?
Well, you should comment on this. Sarwar and I were talking last night about this very topic, so I know he has a contribution to offer. So I'll be very brief and turn it over to him. But you know, there is a view in the United States that if we can pull India into alignment with us, along with Japan and Australia, then the strategic environment around China is reshaped significantly, and their space to throw their weight around is shrunk. And there's, I think, a real active effort underway by the Biden administration to try to find commonalities of purpose with India to lock in a long-term partnership, not necessarily directed against China, but to have the effect of influencing China's choices. And I think that on the merits, there's a lot of logic to that aspiration. But my only caution is that I think that we should probably have realistic expectations about how far India is willing to go in working alongside of us to confront China. Because India's own identification of its interests and of its threats is different than ours. And the Indians have been nothing if not clear about the fact that they will be guided by their own interest and will not be entrapped by ours in how they work their way forward. But Sarwar, over to you.
I don't have much to add. You've summarized it excellently. I think it would be a mistake for the United States to think that India will ever become an ally in the sense of our European allies. Because India, as you say, like every country, deals with its own national interests. They have there's a lot of commonality right now between the two administrations, and both are taking advantage of it. But India will always go its own way. And I think we should keep that in mind, make a more rational policy. This is about theft. How should we be dealing with the military technology, computer issues, especially the theft of intellectual property? And to that, I will add a line, which is, perhaps some of you know that during the Hamilton era, the United States had a policy of stealing intellectual property, because it was largely an agricultural country. And people realized, or the Hamilton group realized, that unless you become an industrial policy, you really wouldn't have weight around the world. And so the United States government started an organized, underwritten program of stealing secrets from Britain, which was the industrial power. And they even went so far as to say that, listen, if you come over and if you have a patent on something we want, we'll give you the ability to patent it again in America. So I just wanted to say, developing countries, don't just get advanced things. They generally get them through underground means, right? I'll couple another question with it, and that is China a developing country? Because, it ties into this.
Well, look, China's per capita gross domestic product would probably qualify it as a developing country. China also is the world's second largest economy that accounts for close to 20% of global GDP. So I don't think that they, as much as they would like, I don't think that they're entitled to too many exemptions from the rules rules of the road for the global economy. I do acknowledge your point about technology transfer. For decades, the United States has complained about China insisting upon American companies operating in China transferring their technology to Chinese competitors as a condition of entry into the Chinese market. And we have viewed that as an unfair economic practice, and we have challenged it. It is somewhat uncomfortable and ironic that now Ford Motor Company is asking a Chinese electric vehicle battery maker to set up a factory in Michigan for the express purpose of transferring technology so that we can understand how cattle produces electric vehicles for the purposes of technology transfer. We are asking semiconductor companies from South Korea and from Taiwan to build fabrication plants in the United States so that we can better understand how they are producing cutting-edge semiconductor chips. And so there is a certain risk of hypocrisy to what it is that we are talking about. But I think that China has stolen American intellectual property on an industrial scale, and I don't see an equivalence between what we're trying to do in a transparent legal fashion and what China does on a daily basis towards our companies. So I think the United States should stand up as vigorously as it can to protect and defend intellectual property. But I also think that this problem is going to have a correcting nature to it, much as it has had with Japan and South Korea when we've had this problem with them in the past as well. As these countries develop their own intellectual property, they have more incentive to protect their own intellectual property. And China clearly is on a trajectory where it is amassing significant amounts of intellectual property in sectors where we are not competitive. And they're going to have their own incentives to want to protect their intellectual property, which is going to have an effect upon how they view the issue more broadly. So over time, this will begin to smooth itself out. But for American companies, some of which people in this audience have worked with, that doesn't provide comfort for the current moment.
Here's one that you'll have a lot of fun with. 100 years old, Dr. Kissinger goes to China. What did he accomplish?
Well, he proved that 100-year-old people can still be statesmen, which is substantial. Dr. Kissinger is revered in China. He is held up as the model that Chinese wish other American diplomats and politicians would emulate. There doesn't appear to be a lot of people competing for that role of being the emulator of Henry Kissinger on China these days. But nevertheless, he went to China. He met with China's leader. He also met with China's Minister of Defense. I think that was his first meeting in China, which was symbolically significant because China's Minister of Defense is under American sanctions. And the Chinese, I think we're trying to make a point through Dr. Kissinger that they are perfectly comfortable meeting with Americans who respect them, but will not meet with those who sanction them. And so Dr. Kissinger had his own agenda. He wanted to talk about the role of artificial intelligence and how the United States and China are going to manage it. But the Chinese had their agenda for his visit as well, and it came through pretty clear.
Should we really be concerned about artificial intelligence as much as we are? I remember when we were so concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons, technology can't be stopped. Are we doing too much?
Yeah, I don't think that we can stop the development or spread of artificial intelligence technology. But I also don't think that the United States has figured out the answers to how best to regulate and manage this technology either. The reality is that the United States and China are in a league of their own in the world in development and deployment of artificial intelligence technology. There's no other country that is anywhere close to being in the same zip code as the United States and China in overall capacity. And so unless the United States and China can come to some common terms of reference or common understandings around the limits on uses of artificial intelligence in national security, it's not going to happen. And if there are no regulations on the uses of these technologies, then we will find ourselves in a more unpredictable Darwinian world. And that is not, I don't think, in our interest. And so I think that purely out of our own self-interest, there is a logic to trying to explore whether or not there is any commonality of views between the United States and China on how to use and regulate these technologies. But I wouldn't want to leave you with an impression that I think that this is an apples and apples exercise. America, we celebrate ChatGPT and the amazing geniuses who are developing these large language learning models. The Chinese are scared out of their minds about generative artificial intelligence because they can't control it. They don't know what it's going to say and respond to every prompt. They don't know how it's going to react to sensitive questions. And it's one thing to censor the internet. It's another to censor a artificial intelligence system that they don't quite understand how it works. And so we should probably keep that in mind as well as we think about and approach these issues with them.
Why has China been so coy about the origin of COVID?
I don't know. I wish I wish that they haven't been. You know, global science would be improved. Our own public health would be improved if they weren't. My best guess is that it's extraordinarily embarrassing for China's leaders. This, you know, pandemic broke out in central China. The information was suppressed for a period of time, and then it became so widespread that it no longer could be suppressed. And if there was a full transparent accounting of the origins of COVID, it would expose the initial decisions of China's leaders to try to suppress the information, which would, I think, create immense domestic pressure inside China amongst the Chinese people against their leaders to ask, why did you do that? What were you doing? And I don't think that that's a door that they want to open because they can't control where it would lead.
So, Ryan, I haven't been reading out any names because most people chose not to do that, but this is a gentleman by the name of Bruce. What are your thoughts on the Uyghur situation in China? How should we handle it?
So, I thank Bruce for the question. The Uyghurs are a Muslim minority in northwest China, in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. When I served in our embassy in Beijing from 2008 to 2012, part of my responsibility was to travel on a quarterly basis to Xinjiang and be the representative of the U.S. Embassy to this region. And so, you know, this isn't an intellectual issue, it's also a personal issue for me. Over 1 million Uyghurs have been involuntarily detained in Xinjiang. There's debate over whether, you know, the use of the word genocide is appropriate for use. I won't get into that. All I'll say is that it's, you know, just gross violations of people's human rights have been perpetrated in well-documented fashion. The challenge for us is that expressing unilateral moral outrage doesn't have much effect on China's leaders. Sanctioning individual Chinese actors doesn't have much effect on the direction of national policy. And so to the extent that we are able to find ways to rally global views on this issue, I think that's the best avenue, the best hope of trying to have an impact upon China's choices as it relates to this minority population in northwest Xinjiang.
If China really wanted to unify its country to its original territory, why didn't it keep its word to the people of Hong Kong regarding one country, two systems? Wouldn't that allay Taiwan's fears?
It's a good question. I wish I knew the answer. I think that what happened in Hong Kong, so the Chinese leadership developed this concept of one country, two systems for Hong Kong, but they were really thinking about Taiwan. Hong Kong was the test case to prove that one country, two systems would allow a people, in this case in Hong Kong, to enjoy significant liberties and freedoms to pursue free market economics underneath the umbrella of one country. And the hope among China's leaders was that this model would be so successful and prove so attractive that it would compel the people of Taiwan to say, I want to be a part of that too. This all ran aground in 2019 when Hong Kong students began to protest en masse because their rights were being taken away from them. And it led to chaotic scenes of 1 million people on the streets of Hong Kong protesting. And the protests eventually were suppressed. And Hong Kong's citizens' civil liberties were further restricted. And I think the reason that the Chinese leadership did that was that they worried that if the people of Hong Kong had success in achieving their goals through civil disobedience and mass protest, my God, what would happen in other cities in China? And so they made a decision that despite the fact that this would kill their ability to sell one country, two systems to the people of Taiwan, that it was a decision that had to be made because if they didn't, it could invite contagion throughout China that could put a threat to the continuing leadership of the Chinese Communist Party.
Is President Xi playing to history? Does he feel he just has so much time to do what he wants to get done?
Well, I do think that President Xi is playing to history, his narrative of history, and his belief that history is written by the winners. And as long as China can win, then they can control the overall narrative. But I don't think that he's acting with patience. I think he's acting with urgency and impatience. I think he's reflecting his own mortality and the fact that he is perpetually insecure. You know, when we in the United States look at China, we look at China as this colossus that's rising on the world stage and sort of trampling across the international landscape. It's worth remembering that when President Xi became president in 2012, there were visible fissures at the top of the Chinese Communist Party. He was worried that there was going to be a coup waged against him by Zhou Yongkang and Ling Jihua. There was a more charismatic leader, Bo Xilai, in Chongqing that challenged him for leadership of the country and the party. There was questions about the continuing efficacy of China's economic model as it was beginning to sputter a bit. There was rampant corruption. There were questions about how much control the Chinese Communist Party had over the military and the public security system. And so when he entered office, he felt like he wasn't stepping into a brand new Cadillac, but rather a jalopy that needed to be repaired. And that's the mindset that he has taken, sort of this fierce urgency and insistence on grabbing more and more control over the levers of power in China and eventually over Chinese society to try to limit and reduce and shrink any potential threats to his leadership. I'm not offering this as a justification or alibi for his actions, but just to try to offer a window into the mindset that I observed being around him through the various encounters that I've had in his presence.
Why are you both dressed alike? No, that's my question, signaling that we've run out of time, and only because Ryan has to leave to catch a plane. So OSHER is, Ryan, jewel in the crown here in the Upper Valley. Thanks for coming out, helping us burnish this. And ladies and gentlemen, another round of applause.